What if the most famous description of the Antichrist was never actually written about the Antichrist at all? For centuries, readers have searched ancient religious texts for clues about the final enemy of God. They look to Daniel, they look to Revelation, they look to Paul's description of the man of lawlessness. But there is another ancient text that creates an even stranger puzzle, 1st Enoch. The text is ancient enough to have been known before Christianity existed. Parts of it were copied by Jewish communities around the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The New Testament letter of Jude even quotes a passage from it when speaking about divine judgment. Yet 1st Enoch never uses the word Antichrist. It never gives us a neat 7-point checklist with that name attached to it. And that is precisely what makes the story interesting. Because when several passages from 1st Enoch are placed beside one another, they reveal a recurring pattern involving deception, corruption, distorted order, forbidden knowledge, moral collapse, wealth, violence, and finally open defiance of God. The question is not whether Enoch literally predicted the modern world. It did not say that. The real question is more unsettling. Why did an ancient Jewish apocalyptic tradition describe a progression in which corruption begins with what people believe, moves into how they understand order and knowledge, and eventually reaches the point where society can no longer recognize the difference between truth and deception? And if the third stage is interpreted as the spread of knowledge that was once considered dangerous or forbidden, then the argument becomes especially provocative because that condition is no longer hypothetical. But before connecting any ancient text to the present, we need to understand what 1st Enoch actually is. 1st Enoch is not a single book written by one man at one moment in history. It is a collection of several works that were composed at different times and eventually brought together under the name of Enoch, the mysterious figure from Genesis, who is described as the 7th generation from Adam. The collection contains the Book of the Watchers, the parables or similitudes, the astronomical book, the Book of Dreams, and the Epistle of Enoch. Scholars debate the precise dates of several sections, particularly the parables, but there is broad agreement that the collection developed over a long period rather than being created as one unified document. That fact changes everything, because when someone says, the Book of Enoch predicts the Antichrist, the immediate question should be, which section? The answer matters because different sections were written in different historical circumstances and address different problems. The oldest material includes traditions about heavenly beings called the Watchers. According to the story, these beings descend to Earth and teach humanity things that radically transform human society. This is where the first major clue appears. The Watchers do not simply commit a supernatural crime. They transmit knowledge. And Enoch spends an unusual amount of time describing exactly what that knowledge includes. Weapons, metalworking, cosmetics, root cutting and medicinal knowledge, astrology, knowledge of the stars, knowledge of clouds, knowledge of the earth, the movements of the moon, and writing. The passage is fascinating because these are not random magical tricks. They are recognizable human technologies and systems of knowledge. But Enoch's concern is not that knowledge itself is evil. The problem is the combination of knowledge, power, and moral irresponsibility. The Watchers give humanity abilities without giving humanity the moral discipline necessary to control those abilities. That distinction is crucial, because the ancient writer is not saying technology exists, therefore the end has arrived. The argument is much deeper. Knowledge changes what human beings are capable of doing. If capability expands faster than wisdom, the result can become destructive. That idea is thousands of years old. But Enoch places it inside an apocalyptic framework. The story begins with a corruption of boundaries. Heavenly beings cross a boundary they were not supposed to cross. They reveal knowledge that was not supposed to be revealed. Humanity receives abilities that change the structure of society, and then the consequences spread. This gives us the first major stage, not destruction, not war, not a world dictator. Information. In 1st Enoch, the corruption of humanity is repeatedly connected with false words, distorted teaching, and the manipulation of what people believe. One passage warns against those who write lying and godless words and cause others to hear them and act foolishly. That is remarkably relevant to any discussion about deception. But we should be careful with the word relevant. Relevant does not mean predicted. An ancient writer could not have known about social media, artificial intelligence, digital propaganda, or modern mass communication. But the underlying human problem is timeless. People can be manipulated by information. And once false information is recorded, repeated, copied, and distributed, it becomes much harder to distinguish from truth. That is why the first stage can be understood as the corruption of the record. The danger is not simply that somebody lies. The danger is that lies become part of the information environment. When enough false claims surround a person, truth does not necessarily disappear. Something more subtle happens. Confidence in truth begins to disappear, and once people no longer trust the record, the foundation for everything else becomes unstable. This brings us to the second stage, Order itself begins to become uncertain. One of the most distinctive sections of 1st Enoch is its astronomical book, which describes the movements of the sun, moon, stars, seasons, and calendar. The text is deeply concerned with correct measurement of time. It describes a 364-day calendar and presents the heavenly movements as part of a divinely established order. To modern readers, this can sound like a strange technical detail, but to the ancient writer, time was not merely something humans measured with clocks. Time was part of creation. The sun had its course, the moon had its course. The stars had their appointed paths. The seasons arrived according to an order, and human beings were expected to recognize that order. The text warns about corruption in the reckoning of days and seasons. Again, the modern temptation is to immediately turn this into a prediction about calendars today. That would go beyond the evidence. The actual ancient concern was religious and astronomical. If humanity loses the correct measure of sacred time, people can end up observing the wrong days while believing they're observing the right ones. That idea introduces something more sophisticated than simple deception. It introduces manufactured confusion. The first stage attacks what people know. The second attacks how people organize what they know. Truth becomes uncertain, then time becomes uncertain. And this prepares the ground for the third stage. This is where the story becomes especially interesting. The third stage concerns knowledge that changes human capability. The Watchers teach metallurgy and weapons production. They teach techniques associated with appearance, medicinal plants, astronomy, and other forms of specialized knowledge. The ancient author sees these teachings as part of humanity's corruption because they came through beings who violated the boundaries imposed upon them. The question is, what happens after the teachers are punished? And here the text gives us an important idea. The knowledge does not simply disappear. The teachers are restrained, but the knowledge has already entered human society. That means the genie is out of the bottle. Once a capability exists, it can spread. Once a technique is taught, it can be copied. Once information is recorded, it can be transmitted to people who never met the original teacher. This is the part of Enoch that can be connected cautiously to the modern world, not because Enoch predicted computers. It did not. Not because it predicted artificial intelligence. It did not. Not because it predicted modern weapons. It did not. But because it understood something remarkably important about civilization. Knowledge is cumulative. A society does not forget every dangerous discovery simply because the people who introduced it disappear. The knowledge remains. It can be improved. It can be scaled. And eventually it can become ordinary. Consider the ancient writers' examples. Metalworking begins as a specialized craft. Weapons manufacturing becomes more sophisticated. Medicinal knowledge expands. Knowledge of the sky becomes systematic. Writing allows information to survive the individual who discovered it. The underlying pattern is the expansion of human capability, and this is why the third stage is sometimes presented as the one that has already happened. But there is an important correction. The claim that the third stage has already happened is not a historical fact established by 1st Enoch. It is an interpretation. The argument is that humanity now possesses enormous technological and scientific capabilities, many of which can be used for healing, construction, communication, exploration, or destruction. That much is undeniable. But connecting those capabilities to the Watcher's prophecy requires a theological interpretation. A historian cannot prove that modern technology is the fulfillment of an ancient supernatural prediction. At the same time, dismissing the comparison completely would also miss what makes the ancient text fascinating. The deeper issue is not whether technology is demonic. The deeper issue is whether capability can outrun wisdom. That question is more relevant today than ever. Human beings can manipulate biological systems. We can create weapons capable of destroying cities. We can alter organisms. We can build machines that process information at an enormous scale. We can place satellites around the planet. We can observe distant galaxies. We can generate synthetic images and voices. We can distribute information to millions of people almost instantly. None of those things were predicted by Enoch, but they demonstrate the principle that Enoch was already concerned about. Knowledge expands human power, and human power does not automatically produce moral wisdom. That brings us to the fourth stage: observation, measurement, recording. First, Enoch repeatedly describes human actions as being recorded and observed before judgment arrives. The imagery is theological, but the concept is powerful. People behave as though their actions disappear. Enoch insists that they do not. The text describes deeds being written down and preserved. The ancient writer's point is ultimately moral. Hidden actions are not actually hidden from divine judgment. But this creates an interesting connection with the earlier stages. First comes information, then order, then expanded knowledge, then measurement and record-keeping. The sequence moves toward a world in which human behavior is increasingly documented. Again, we have to resist the temptation to say, Enoch predicted surveillance cameras. It did not. Ancient societies had no concept of digital surveillance networks, but the broader concept of continuous observation is certainly understandable to a modern audience. Today, enormous amounts of human behavior can be recorded. Financial transactions leave records. Phones generate location data. Online activity can be stored. Images can be captured. Messages can be archived. Purchases can be tracked. Searches can be logged. None of this proves Enoch's prophecy, but it does create an eerie philosophical parallel. The ancient text imagines a world in which actions that people think are hidden are nevertheless being recorded. Modern technology has created a world in which many actions that once disappeared into memory can now leave permanent digital traces. The similarity is conceptual, not predictive, and that distinction matters. Because if we exaggerate the connection, we turn a fascinating ancient text into clickbait. If we examine the connection honestly, the text becomes much more interesting. The fifth stage concerns accumulation. First, Enoch repeatedly condemns people who acquire wealth through injustice and deception. The problem is not simply that someone possesses money. The criticism is directed toward wealth acquired through wrongdoing and then used as the foundation for further power. The wealthy believe they have accumulated everything they want. But Enoch's warning is that wealth obtained through injustice eventually becomes evidence against the people who accumulated it. This connects naturally with the previous stage. First, actions are recorded. Then wealth and wrongdoing accumulate. The record becomes evidence. This creates a broader picture of a society where corruption is not isolated. It compounds. One dishonest act can produce another. One corrupt institution can protect another. One concentration of wealth can create greater influence. And once influence grows, it becomes easier to protect the original wrongdoing. This is not unique to ancient societies. Every civilization has struggled with corruption and unequal power, but Enoch frames the problem as an accumulation of moral debt. The more injustice accumulates, the heavier the eventual judgment becomes. And that leads into the sixth stage, social fracture. One of the darkest passages in 1 Enoch describes families turning against one another, parents and children, brothers, relatives. The smallest social bonds begin to break. This is important because Enoch does not simply describe an army invading a country. It describes society collapsing from inside. The family, which should be the most basic structure of trust, becomes a place of violence. That makes the sixth stage fundamentally different from the previous ones. The earlier stages concern information, order, knowledge, measurement, and accumulation. Now the consequences reach human relationships. The result is not simply political instability, it is the breakdown of trust. And once trust collapses, almost every institution becomes fragile. A government requires trust. A legal system requires trust. Markets require trust. Families require trust. Religious communities require trust. Even ordinary communication requires some basic assumption that other people are telling the truth. If that assumption disappears, society becomes increasingly difficult to coordinate. This is why the sequence in 1 Enoch can be read as a progression from invisible corruption to visible destruction. The first stages are difficult to see. False information, distorted order, dangerous knowledge, accumulated records, concentrated wealth. Then suddenly the consequences become impossible to ignore. Families turn against families. Fear replaces trust. And after this comes the final stage, speech, open defiance. First, Enoch repeatedly condemns proud and hard words spoken against God. The final form of rebellion is no longer hidden, it is public. The person or group no longer merely behaves wrongly. The rebellion is spoken. This is where later Christian traditions about an ultimate adversary begin to sound familiar. Paul describes this man of lawlessness who exalts himself. Daniel describes a terrifying ruler who speaks great things. Revelation describes a beast whose mouth utters blasphemies. These texts are not identical to Enoch. They were written in different contexts and have different theological frameworks. But there is a recognizable thematic relationship. The final enemy is associated not merely with physical violence, but with arrogant claims about authority. And this brings us back to the word Antichrist. First Enoch does not use it. The term belongs to the New Testament tradition, particularly the Johannine letters, where Antichrist is associated with opponents of Christ and false teaching. Later, Christian interpretation brought together several different biblical images: Daniel's hostile ruler, Paul's man of lawlessness, Revelation's beast, and other apocalyptic figures. Over time, these traditions became part of the popular concept of a single final Antichrist. But that synthesis should not be projected backward onto 1 Enoch as though the ancient author used the same terminology. He did not. What Enoch gives us is something different. A world increasingly characterized by corruption. A world in which knowledge can become destructive. A world where truth can be manipulated. A world where order can be distorted. A world where wealth can become concentrated through injustice. A world where families can fracture. And finally, a world where rebellion becomes open and proud. Now comes the most controversial question. If these are 7 stages, where are we today? This is where the title of this video becomes deliberately provocative, because there are people who would look at modern society and say that the first stage is already obvious. Misinformation is everywhere. The second stage, our relationship with time and information has been transformed by global communication, digital media, and a world that never truly sleeps. The third, humanity possesses technologies that would have been unimaginable to the ancient world. The fourth, almost everything we do can potentially leave a record. The fifth, global wealth and economic inequality are major political and social questions. The sixth, political polarization and social fragmentation are visible in many countries. And the seventh, public hostility toward religious belief, religious institutions, and traditional moral claims is certainly widespread. But notice something. Every one of those observations can be true without First Enoch being a prediction of modern history. That is the crucial intellectual boundary. Human history repeatedly produces periods of deception, technological transformation, wealth concentration, family conflict, and religious controversy. If an ancient text contains broad warnings about human corruption, there will almost always be moments when those warnings appear relevant. That does not automatically make the text prophetic in the modern predictive sense. The more interesting question is why the pattern continues to resonate. Perhaps the answer is that Enoch was never primarily trying to give future generations a calendar. It was trying to explain how corruption spreads, and that is a very different kind of warning. The most dangerous society is not necessarily one where everyone suddenly becomes evil. It is one where each individual change appears small. A little misinformation, a little dishonesty, a little corruption, a little abuse of power, a little technological irresponsibility, a little social division, a little contempt for opponents. Individually, each development can seem manageable. Together, they can transform a civilization. That is the deeper message, hiding beneath the sensational claims about the Antichrist. And it also explains why the third stage is so fascinating. The Watcher's story is not fundamentally about machines. It is about knowledge without restraint. The ancient writer imagined supernatural beings giving humanity knowledge that it was not prepared to handle. Modern civilization has reached a point where the question of restraint has become unavoidable. We can create technologies faster than societies can establish ethical rules for them. We can distribute information faster than institutions can verify it. We can develop powerful tools faster than laws can regulate them. We can create systems that affect billions of people before ordinary citizens understand how those systems work. Again, this does not mean Enoch predicted the 21st century, but it does mean the ancient warning remains philosophically alive. Power is not the same thing as wisdom. Information is not the same thing as truth. Technology is not the same thing as progress, and wealth is not the same thing as righteousness. That may be the most important lesson of all. Because the popular version of the Antichrist story often focuses on one terrifying individual suddenly appearing and taking control of the world. First, Enoch gives us a more complicated picture. Before open rebellion comes preparation. Before the final declaration comes gradual corruption. Before the visible crisis comes a transformation of the environment in which people think. That is why the sequence matters. The enemy, in the traditional interpretation, does not simply walk onto the stage and convince everyone instantly. The world has already been prepared to accept the message. Truth has become difficult to identify. Order has become confused. Power has expanded. Records have multiplied. Wealth has accumulated. Trust has deteriorated. And society has become divided. Only then does the final voice appear. Whether someone interprets this literally, symbolically, historically, or theologically depends on their worldview. But one thing can be established with confidence. First, Enoch is not a medieval invention. The discovery of Aramaic Enoch manuscripts among the Dead Sea Scrolls demonstrated that substantial portions of the work were circulating in antiquity. One of the manuscripts, 4Q-1, was copied roughly between 200 and 150 BCE. And Jude's letter demonstrates that Enochic tradition was known within early Christianity. Jude 14:15 contains a quotation closely related to 1 Enoch 1.9, making the relationship between the two texts historically significant. Modern scholarship continues to investigate exactly how Jude accessed and adapted the Enochic tradition. But that does not mean every statement in 1 Enoch should automatically be treated as a direct prediction. The text is a complex collection. Its sections developed at different times. Its manuscripts exist in different languages and textual forms. And scholars continue to debate the dating and interpretation of some portions, especially the parables. That uncertainty does not make the book worthless. It makes careful reading more important. The real mystery is not that Enoch supposedly predicted smartphones, surveillance cameras, artificial intelligence, or modern weapons. It did not. The real mystery is that an ancient Jewish text understood a problem that every technological civilization eventually confronts. What happens when human ability grows faster than human wisdom? What happens when information becomes abundant but truth becomes difficult to identify? What happens when wealth becomes concentrated and trust begins to disappear? What happens when people become more connected technologically while becoming more divided socially? And what happens when a society becomes so accustomed to corruption that the final act of rebellion no longer appears shocking? Those questions do not require us to believe that the Antichrist has already arrived. They do not require us to identify a modern politician, corporation, technology, or religious figure as a fulfillment of prophecy. And they certainly do not justify declaring that a particular current event proves the end times have begun. Instead, they invite us to read Enoch as an ancient warning about the architecture of corruption. The first stage is the corruption of truth. The second is the corruption of order. The third is the uncontrolled expansion of knowledge and capability. The fourth is the accumulation of records and accountability. The fifth is the accumulation of wealth and power. The sixth is the collapse of social bonds. And the seventh is open rebellion. Whether that sequence was intended as a literal prophecy of future history is a question scholars and religious readers will continue to debate. But the progression itself is remarkably coherent. And perhaps that is why the third stage feels so uncomfortable. Because the third stage does not require a mysterious future event. Humanity already possesses extraordinary knowledge. The question is what humanity does with it. The ancient writer could not have known the world we live in, but he understood something fundamental about human beings. Give people greater power, and you do not automatically make them better. Give people more information, and you do not automatically make them wiser. Give people more wealth, and you do not automatically make them more righteous. Give people more freedom, and you do not automatically eliminate conflict. Civilization advances technologically. Human nature does not necessarily advance at the same speed. That is the tension at the center of 1 Enoch. And it may be more valuable than any prediction about the identity of an Antichrist. Because if the ancient warning is taken seriously, the greatest danger is not simply that an evil ruler appears. The greater danger is that society becomes ready for one. That is a very different warning. And it places responsibility not only on some future villain, but on ordinary people living in the present. How do we decide what is true? How do we determine which sources deserve trust? How do we use powerful technologies responsibly? How do we prevent wealth from becoming a substitute for morality? How do we preserve families and communities when political and cultural divisions become intense? And how do we recognize manipulation before it becomes normal? Those questions are much harder than identifying a mysterious figure and calling him the Antichrist. But perhaps that is exactly why they matter. First Enoch does not give us a simple countdown. It gives us a warning about progression. Corruption rarely announces itself as corruption. It usually arrives disguised as convenience, certainty, power, entertainment, wealth, ideology, or progress. And by the time the final consequences become obvious, the earlier stages may already have become normal. That is why the ancient text deserves to be read carefully rather than sensationally. The Book of Enoch did not give us a verified 7-step prophecy of the Antichrist. What it gave us was something more complicated and, in some ways, more disturbing. A picture of what happens when knowledge grows without wisdom, power grows without restraint, wealth grows without justice, and truth becomes increasingly difficult to separate from deception. The third stage may already have happened, or perhaps it is better to say that the condition Enoch warned about has existed for a very long time and continues to develop in new forms. The distinction matters, because prophecy should not be manufactured from hindsight, and ancient texts should not be forced to say what their authors never said, but neither should we ignore the uncomfortable questions they raise. 2,000 years ago, writers working within Jewish apocalyptic traditions were already asking what happens when humanity receives extraordinary knowledge and fails to develop the moral discipline to control it. Today, humanity is living with capabilities those writers could never have imagined. So perhaps the most important question is not whether Enoch predicted our technology. It is whether our technology has made Enoch's warning more important. Because the future may not be decided by whether humanity discovers more knowledge. Humanity will almost certainly discover more. The real test is whether wisdom can keep pace. And if the ancient warning has any lesson for the present, it is this. The most dangerous stage is not always the moment when evil becomes visible. It may be the moment when people stop recognizing it. If you found this investigation into 1 Enoch and the origins of the Antichrist tradition fascinating, subscribe to the channel for more deep investigations into ancient texts, forgotten history, biblical mysteries, and the discoveries that continue to challenge what we think we know. And if you want to see more videos that separate what ancient sources actually say from the theories built around them, make sure you stay with us, because the next mystery may be even more difficult to explain.